Actually, I came to Malaysia first in 1992 when I ran a bioinformatics workshop at So I have been doing this for some time, running workshops. But I wish we no longer run any introductory workshops. We should be running specialist series by now. So many years have elapsed. And I'm happy to say that Malaysia is doing well and progressing. But we need to up the pace because sooner or later we'll trip over the data. That's what's going to happen. And this is already old hat. Big Data to Knowledge is 2 years old, 2012 from the NIH. It's an initiative. But I thought it might be timely because in our 2011 meeting, the Minister for Science and Technology from Malaysia actually said they're going to sequence the genome of every Malaysian. So if that is going to happen, you're going to have extra amount of data to look at. So let's see what we can do. Where does the data come from in biology? This has some of the elements, not all. As you can see there are the chromosomes which provide the genome. So we have genomics coming out of that. Genome contains all the genes which are the coding regions which provide the genetic information in the form of DNA, nucleic acid sequences. And here we are missing the methylation and the epigenetic profile. I think they forgot to stick in the methyl groups. So coding regions or genes make proteins. Proteins, unfortunately, are not so beautifully organized, symmetric, rigorous, straightforward. They are very different. They are like individuals and they act in different ways, which leads to the functional cell because they perform different functions, and they are also the target of all the drugs that are mainly prescribed either over the counter or prescription, and they are the regular kind of medication that is provided. They form the basis of a therapeutic target. So all structure-based drug design is based on the structure of these proteins. And you will see a little bit of not the drug design, but at least the protein structure in one of my latest slides. These, of course, don't work on their own. Some of them do, but many of them work as teams, as groups, as communities, in what are called pathways and systems, which is what these wiring diagrams are all about. And then they also have communities, that is, they talk to each other. Cells contact and communicate with each other. We are working on a set of proteins called claudins back in Australia, and these are very rare proteins. They are only expressed on the surface, and each cell has a different subset of the claudin family. So we are just writing a review, and we hope to follow up with more scientific work later on. So with the start of the Human Genome Project race in 2001, we have seen all these lovely pictures which describe the helix in terms of human beings and the double helix with lots of faces of people here. So this is to represent all of humanity. As you all know, we share a lot of the genetic factors, not all, but most of them. Then came the race of the ethics. Should this genome be public or private? So we have Craig Venter here, who's now gone on to build his own institute, and Francis Collins, who's currently the director of NIH. So they have, of course, Francis fought for the public funding of the human genome. The funds were also raised simultaneously in Europe at the Sanger Center, and we have the human genome coming out from the public as well as the private around the same time. And this led to all kinds of prophecies, searching for the real stuff of life. This came in Financial Times, and then Business Week said this is biotech's next holy grail. Yes, why was the human genome sequenced in the first place? Do you know why? Who was the main funder of this project? Not DOE. NIH funded the project and later on formed NHGRI, of which Eric Green is the director now. But the funding was basically to provide a rational basis for how we deal with disease and to bring down the costs of healthcare from the knowledge of the genome. So it's a very economic omics, not the genomics that we are talking about, but really looking at bringing the healthcare costs down. At the same time, we had all these talks. Instead of having a Medicare card, I don't know what you have with Obamacare, but we have a Medicare card, which is a little green card, which we take every time we go to see the GP. It has your personal ID on it. But it doesn't have any details of your blood tests or your previous records or whether you've been ill or you had a fracture or you went to the hospital. Nothing. So maybe all that information can also be put in. We hope they can access it with our number. But more importantly, it doesn't tell them whether you will have an adverse reaction to a prescription medicine which is based on your genetic makeup. More importantly, the basic dogma of molecular biology is all on the left, and soon we may even have more columns on this table because we had this wonderful one-to-one-to-one mapping, one gene, one transcript, one protein, takes one metabolite, forms one product, etc., etc. It's not working. So now we know the genes are many, the transcripts are even more numerous than the genes, and they lead to many proteins. And if you actually take into account the post-translational modifications, this number really blows out of proportion, and they work on several metabolites as well as compounds that we inhale, compounds that we get through the water, and all other drugs which are not so regularly prescribed but you can get from the black market. So there's a whole lot of things that are going into you and they are interacting with all these things. What we do know is that this is one, many and all. So if we looked at all the genes, we get all the omics put at the end of it. The problem is getting the genome is not enough because as you can see, the genome of the caterpillar and the butterfly is identical. It has exactly the same alphabets. It's folded up in the same formation. It's got the double helical structure. So why does this look like this and why does this look so pretty? So that is the question. And what are the changes as you go along the developmental stages? So we do know that although the DNA is static, we have RNA which comes and goes, transient, which leads to protein formation. Eventually the protein levels can also be shut down if we have sufficient. So these are temporal in nature. They are generated when required and shut off when required due to signaling. So we are looking at phenomenally different proteomes, phenomenally meaning a phenome, which is therefore the entity that you see which is holding all these multiple data sets within itself. So what is a phenome? The phenome is the observable phenotype. The classic biological terminology of phenotype, because the genotype is the same, however the phenotype depends on the developmental stage, the environmental factors, etc., etc., the subcellular localization in higher organisms, and your disease state and your stress levels, whether you are stuck in traffic, everything. It all matters because it's all going into saying that this is what you are at that instant in time. It's like taking a photograph. So phenotype can also be measured in terms of the protein content, because these are the carriers and the actors in the living cell. These actually perform functional roles, and you can call them characters in the play of the cell, and their isoforms, they are all dynamically generated as and when required. For example, PSA is a transcript, is an isoform of kallikrein 3. So prostate specific antigen, it's a protein. So proteins actually play critical roles also in gene regulation. You need proteins to actually switch on gene regulation. You need the protein machinery to make the transcript, and also you need the protein machinery to make the proteins. So everything is done by proteins. RNA does have function. In some cases it does provide the role of catalyst, like enzymes, especially from the primordial state. However, in today, the majority of the functional roles are still carried out by proteins. So now we have modern instruments, reagents, bioinformatics, etc., that can help us to get all this data and to integrate it. And proteins are still our primary goal because they actually are the target of drugs and can be themselves used as drugs. When you take a peptide vaccine, you're actually getting bits of protein into you. And that is the basis of T-cell based vaccinology, which is the most efficient way to control any kind of disease. And Asif and I used to work on an NIH project on the dengue. Unfortunately, I think the funding stopped somewhere, and we were on a track to get something towards a vaccine. I hope we still succeed. Okay, very recently, earlier this year, we had the draft human proteomes come out. I am not going to critique this because this is a mammoth effort. 2 studies were actually published, which is supposed to be the book of proteins for human beings, very similar to Gray's Anatomy for the medicos. So it was supposed to give a catalog of the proteins. Just a year before, there was something called the Cell Atlas or the Protein Atlas, which tells us where these proteins are found, in which organs, in which cell types, in which tissues, because although the genome is the same, not every protein is expressed everywhere to the same extent. That is where the distribution of the organelle or the subtype or the cell type occurs, and that therefore gives us special access to tissues and cells, which therefore we need to understand. And the genome doesn't provide that. It just provides a full map. So it tells us everything about everything, but not how these things are known. Very recently there was a BBC commentary on that, if you read BBC News. So maybe you'd like to look at that. It is very important also that biologists understand the physical basis of the bioinformatics, and therefore they can make sense out of this. Actually, integrating all these high throughput data sets is what is going to give us answers, but this is really a mind-boggling problem because we have the phenome, we have the organs, tissues, cells at the gross level. Then at the molecular level, we have somewhere the genome. Then we have the copy number variants. Then we have the transcriptome, which is the RNA, the complete RNA profile. The epigenome, the methylation of the chromatin. We have the microRNAs, which have several roles. And every time you open a journal or look at a PDF, there are new roles coming out for these microRNAs. They can also be used as vaccine candidates, I believe. Then we have the proteome, which is easier to understand because proteins are much larger, bulkier, and they are encoded within the human genome. And then the proteome works with the metabolome. The metabolome is the purview of the chemists because they are small molecules. Biologists really should learn the chemistry of the small molecules because that is where we understand how things are modified, changed, metabolized, and also can drugs be made to look more like metabolites, because then they would be more efficient, more functional, and more targeted. We had a chem informatics PhD student, and we have done a whole thesis on this, but this is not the forum, so I'm not going to tell you any more about that. When we get all this data, they all not only have to be integrated in time, then we have to make things like maps. We get the data, we get maybe the expression level, transcripts from different tissues. How does this change with time? What is the temporal variation in the gene expression? Has it to do with day and night, our activity, our conditions? Documentation is very sparse, but this is being carried out right now, and maybe we will have the data one day, because then we will have many genomes. If you think of the genome as epigenetically modified by methylation, then we will have many transcriptomes depending on what the stimuli were and what point in time the sample was drawn, which lead to many proteomes. None of them are on a one-to-one correlation, unfortunately, because when gene gets, the chromatin gets methylated, it doesn't actually let the gene get expressed, so we may not see the rest of the downstream process. It's more like inhibitory. Then we have all the metabolites that interact. Many of these interact with each other. Metabolites interact with different proteins. Proteins can interact with RNA. Proteins can also interact with the genome. Transcriptomes or the RNA can themselves interact with metabolome if you know that they have an enzymatic activity. So it gets very muddled and confused. In health and this in disease, where some of these components have stepped out of line. So these are the kinds of complicated situations that we are encountering. When we have understood all this, in terms of time and the subcellular localization and the space, so we are a bit away from that, but we're getting there, hopefully one day. If you want to do actually genomic medicine, this is the kind of thing that you need to prepare. You need blood samples, tissue samples, models, model animals, and then you do all these tests. So a clinician orders a totally different type of sets. How can the clinical tests and their results be related to all this molecular information? That is another very big issue that we are facing currently. So we have the histopathology and the stains and the various other samples, the CTs, etc. that they, the PET, whatever scans they provide, X-rays, they're all huge data sets anyway. Then we have the single level classifications from MRI, image-based analysis, the genomics-based analysis, which are copy number, methylation, and sequence classifications. This includes all your SNPs or single nucleotide polymorphisms, which could lead to propensity for disease. Then we have the transcriptome, expression levels, classification, microRNA, and latest on the scene is the non-coding RNA, what they call so-called junk DNA, but now are not classified as junk. It's like you threw your email into the trash and then went back and fished it out. Same concept. Now we bring it back. It has been questioned by many people, including Dan Grauer, who's now leading the challenge against the people who call junk DNA. Why would nature have it in the genome if it was junk? Because nature is known for its economy. It's very, very frugal, it's very careful, it's very, it doles even ATP out in small doses. So why should it have junk DNA and carry it over from cell to cell? It's costly to transcribe, copy it into every cell, right? Duplicate. Why waste all these bases? So nothing goes to waste. So that is going on in the world if you read scientific literature and scientific goss. There's a whole lot of flack flying around on that. That's non-coding RNA. Now some non-coding RNAs have been sequenced and found to make functional proteins. So if you read the literature on non-coding, you are going to find all this. They also have a lot of control and transcription regulation elements. Then we have proteomics, which are the protein classification from various methodologies. Not only mass spec, immunohistochemistry, antigen binding, etc. So there are quite a few of these. Then we have the metabolomics, which are the small molecules that you collect from samples. Okay. Coffee, tea, etc. also contain a whole lot of metabolites. Metabolite-like compounds that are actually in our system right now. So then we have to integrate them into classifications that will give us the various classes, even say for breast cancer. We have the different classes, the subtypes, the grades, the stages of the cancer, the proliferation state, etc., which then help the clinicians to figure out how to treat this patient. What are they supposed to do? What would work best under the circumstances? So here we get the clinical outcome, we get the response signature, resistance signature, adverse effect signature, which then can be used for personalized treatment. Many of these data can actually be integrated into predictive models which give us a predictive outcome. What is the survival rate for these patients? Is it going to be try again? There is a new movie out, the story of Annie Parker. If anybody has a chance, please see it. It talks about the days when people didn't believe that cancer had a genetic basis. This is the first serious scientific study to show that breast cancer is inheritable, runs in families because it has a genetic predisposition. Please see this because it talks about the old days when science was done with mail, saints' mail. People sent letters, then the doctors sent letters and so on. It's very interesting. But it shows you what you can do today. It shows you how much you have and why not do something with it. So you need to hurry up. So hopefully the expected impact is here. Many of this data can be actually used as predictive. Early detection. We have so many approved drugs. Surely if you can catch it at an early stage, before proliferation, before metastasis, there would be an opportunity to keep these people productive, give them happier, healthier lives for as long as we can. So early detection will be the key. And as I said, all these omics in the end mean the study of life today, but they also are underpinned by the denominator, economics. So that is also an omics, maybe by chance, maybe by design, but definitely that's going to matter because healthcare is very important. I believe in Malaysia, there was a big problem with obesity and diabetes. So that is something that can be tackled due to lifestyle changes as well as monitoring the genetic makeup predisposition to various disorders. Type 2 diabetes is after all an autoimmune disease. So these are things that people can actually work on and start. So there are lots of things that you can start. It doesn't always have to be cancer. In fact, a lot of money has gone into cancer. Unfortunately, cancer patients, only a few of them actually survive and shake the disease off forever. So it is also important to study other diseases so that population can support the effort that goes into cancer. So please spread your bets and work really, in an area where you can make significance and actually make a difference in your own country. So this big data initiative, BD2K, it's called, initiative from NIH, it's here, the website. It's actually to do everything to do with data, and they stuck it on only the continental US, not the outlying states. So I think they ran out of room. But as you can see, it is to develop research tools for clinical applications, biomedical data. It's a project, it integrates science, proposed training methods. You are familiar with all this. So why not use these terms, integrate them and just get all the data and apply it. So that's what it's all about. What kind of data are we talking about? One human genome contains how many bases? I heard something, somebody's phone's
3 billion.
3 billion, yes, 3 billion bases. 3 billion characters do not occupy a lot of space. The problem comes when you multiply it by the number of people, the population. If you are able to collect the samples and do DNA sequencing, which is expensive. What is frequently done are the current short read methods, which look for marker regions and then map it to the original genome to look for changes. Okay, that gives you a changed picture. So some portions are not so changeable, so they don't sequence those, they only sequence the regions. This is called the budget genome. Okay, this is the quick way, which is what Illumina and all these short read companies, PacBio, are trying to present. Okay, but it's enough for clinical studies. When you come to medical data, they are huge. All the scans already have images which have lots and lots of pixels. They are like the star maps. They are into gigabytes if you have a full body scan. Okay, if not terabytes depending on the resolution. Proteomics data is large. A simple run is like 50 gigs. Lot of data. A speed protein structure, its data is large but not as big as the proteomics data. So currently, the Human Proteome Project has started a computational mass spec initiative. How are we going to deal with the data from proteomics? Why? If you were to actually look for an early biomarker, you can take blood samples. It's possible now to actually do studies with nanoliters of blood. Look for biomarkers, cancer biomarkers. But you need to run the proteomics so many times to capture the position or the quantification of the proteins under different run conditions, whether they are phosphorylated, whether they are glycosylated, and so on. And then finally, you get huge amounts of data. Now, who's going to analyze them? That is another issue. So already proteomics is starting to create a bottleneck in this part of the world. So we not only need the facility to store them, retrieve them, query them, and so on, making them discoverable, accessible, and citable. What do they mean citable? Give everybody who has a database a paper because they get promoted or they get a grant. Otherwise, we can't maintain these databases. They are huge repositories. Then we need research and development, R&D, to provide us methods. Fundamentally, the mathematical statistical tools to do the analysis, software, which then help provide the black box for pathologists or technicians to run the samples through, and the tools required to analyze this data. Still, it is remaining biomedical. From biotechnology, they came down to biomedical, so they're not gone beyond that. Then, we need to enhance training and development, the use of these methods and tools. We need the skilled people. So I think the PG DIP is a step in the right direction, but we could do much more, maybe a master's degree or something, or even PhD, to support this data ecosystem that accelerates discovery as part of a digital enterprise. You need the backing of the government. So you need a new way to approach this data, to query it, to match it and integrate it. So we are needing actually innovation at multiple levels. And how to distribute this data. If you collect the data and you want to send it to your collaborator who's sitting in even another part of the country, how are you going to physically send the data across? We need huge pipes. We need huge infrastructure to do this. So it is not such an easy position. So more on the big data. So besides this, we have the opportunities and challenges of figuring out, managing, analyzing, and integrating data sets of diverse data types. This I'm quoting from the NIH webpage because I want you to study this slide. It talks about imaging, phenotype, molecular exposure data. If you've been exposed to a chemical spill or some kind of fallout, you need to know there is health, behavior, and other types of medical, biological, behavioral data. It's like psychotoxic chemicals released from food sometimes, or even drugs. These are increasingly larger, diverse, and complex. Now wait a minute, haven't we heard all this before? So when I saw this, I thought, all this data can be now put into all these lovely looking clouds. But this is what we already said was actually bioinformatics. So we are going to look at that. So the current obstacles to using this volume of data actually comes from locating the data. Where is it? And how am I going to access it, and the tools. So getting access to the data and software tools. We have a lot of publications, we give a lot of IDs. Oh, my data has been deposited in the database. You go to the database, you can't find the entry. Why? It's embargoed. So even reviewers can't see the data. So how are they supposed to clear that paper? I don't know. So that's the state of affairs. It says embargoed until publication, but you can't see it and review it. So how can you say the paper is good? I don't understand, but that is the current state. Some of the data never gets released. Some of the data gets withdrawn because somehow they found they did the wrong thing. So these things are happening systematically. and nobody is actually looking into it. So it's a lot of stuff to look at the data itself and get access to the tools. The cost of software. Good software is actually licensed and expensive because somebody is going to maintain it and somebody has done their best to develop the world's best. Unfortunately, everybody thinks bioinformatics is cheap. You can do BLAST on the web, can't you? Oh, all you need is one PC, right? No, that's not going to work. You're going to need big infrastructure to do this kind of work. So standardizing the data and the metadata. The big challenge here is that the data is more diverse and more complex. So how are we going to integrate these heterogeneous data types to make sense in the beautifully stacked picture we saw in Nature reviews? It looks very neat and tidy, little files all stacked up and you get the information. No, you don't. It's all a big mess and you're struggling through the morass. So you need to figure all it out beforehand. A lot of experience is required. So not only do we need IT people, we also need to worry about ethics and permissions. Who is going to see all this data? Does it contain any private patient information? The IT guys don't know about all that. Okay? So somebody who's a clinician or an administrator of a facility will have to check into these things. It's very critical because otherwise you will have everybody's genotype and phenotype on the websites. Who knows, your potential employer may say, hey, he's going to take leave, I don't want this guy. So there are a lot of implications here. You heard about 23andMe?
Yeah.
Personalized genomes. What happened to the company? They've all been told not to give all those big lists of surprises with the SNPs because it's causing a lot of mental grief. Children want to be suicidal because there is a big list of potential illnesses they might get sometime. Probability is low. So not everybody gets every disease that you're genetically programmed for. Okay? You can get something new as well, which was not in your genes. So do not actually believe all that. So this is what information leads to and misinformation can lead to. Okay, so we need to organize, manage and process the big data. Now we call it big data because it's gone out of control. We need to develop methods for analysis and integrate and train everybody to use this data. So this is what we called bioinformatics in the old times. This is a slide, it's actually 1995. There was a website which is now gone. I'm sorry, the other bracket is missing. I just typed that in. I actually had to find out which year it was published. This is what we used to say. It's the study of information, content and flow in biological systems and processes. It involved managing data, organizing it, standardizing it, making it heterogeneous data sets talk to each other, compatible, and then writing the software, writing the tools, developing the methodology where there was no method, and then training everybody to do the show. So what's so different? So we are back to the future. Same story, we are doing this. But we are perhaps doing it on a higher scale. But wait, we have better internet connectivity. We have much better resources. Disk is cheap. CPU has become very cheap. You can buy bigger clusters and farms and harness the compute power, but we still need the human beings. So remember that, that's one thing we can't do. So one example is from Davoli et al. It's a Cell paper that came out last year. It was reviewed in Nature Views this year. And this picture is actually from the Nature Review. They used computation. Big data to address the big C, cancer, using computation. So this is a dry, don't make your hands wet experiment. It's based on aneuploidy, one of the hallmarks of cancer. Cancers often have extra or missing chromosomes or pieces of chromosomes or additional copies of genes, which is due to gene duplication at the chromosomal level. So they looked for tumor, they developed this resource called tumor suppressor and oncogene exploser, which they call TUSIN. Maybe they are somewhere near TUSIN. So patterns of mutagenic signatures were extracted. They predict the likelihood that any individual gene functions as a tumor suppressor or an oncogene. Surprise, surprise, they actually found a whole lot of genes which were never listed as oncogenes in this category. So, to continue on, they have this nice image which has the new 10 hallmarks. From 6 we went to 10. And so now we are struggling with 10, and next year we might have 15 hallmarks of cancer. So, this talks about genome instability, sustaining proliferation, altered metabolism, avoiding apoptosis, escaping immune response, invasion. That is the ability to proliferate and move on into other tissues without having the genetic program for it. Okay, so in the continuum of oncogenic potential, that is what their final conclusion is. So they found that aneuploidy has been recognized, but it was proposed about 100 years ago, but ignored, or we didn't have the money and the tools, or we got carried away by GWAS, right? So in between, they've gone back and revisited this. The analysis was carried out on over 8,200 normal tumor pairs. So we have a lot of controls, match controls, and a lot of tumor samples. And they have carried out rigorous statistical processing. Many more genes possess the cancer driver properties than anticipated. That is oncogenic potential. So you can probably you'll soon have a scale of oncogenicity. Now, that was the blurb. So now I thought I'd share a little bit of some of the research that we do. This is only some of it. We have lots of unpublished stuff which we don't talk about till we are actually ready to give you the final result. So we worked on the missing proteins in the human proteome. This was our effort to get into the human proteome, mainly because colleagues kept hammering me from neighboring. The third proteome was coined in Macquarie University. The National Proteome Facility for Australia is on the 4th floor of the building that I'm in. So we are living in a proteomics world in Macquarie. So it was only fair that some of them, when they said we need help, we need some bioinformatics, we said okay, we'll do something for you. But now it's really challenging. So now I have been nominated into the Computational Mass Spec Initiative of UPO. So I'll tell you a little bit about that later. There's a little bit about cancer biomarkers, which is a large-scale study. And there is one structural bioinformatics study, which is very important because even yesterday I got an email from my colleague saying that another new paper is out. This structure we built was actually a model, a structural model for an integrin and another epithelial cancers. So it was very significant. We built the model. We are now going to trial different chemical molecules to actually to annihilate the protein-protein interaction. This stuff has already been done with antigens just a few days ago. The papers come out. So it's a really hot topic, so I thought I'd share that with you. So why are we looking at the proteome? Because we believe that that is what makes us truly human, and we believe that by understanding the proteome and the way proteins interact, we can actually classify or quantify health. If we don't know what is health, how can we actually know what is disease and how to repair and fix it? So this is of course from my colleague Mark Baker, who is the current president of UPO, and he loves these fast cars, as you can tell. Okay. So this we think, but by 2050 we will be able to achieve this as a global initiative. The Human Proteome Project, CHPP, was actually launched in Sydney in 2010, and it's supposed to do lots of fun things like provide a comprehensive list of proteins for the human beings. The focus is only on humans. There are no model organisms, there is no fruit fly, there is no C. elegans here. We have worked with many. We also work with things like truffles, Perigord truffles. We work on different organisms, but this body is only focused on human beings. HUPO stands for the Human Protein Organization. Proteome Organization, similar to HUGO, which stands for the Human Genome Organization. So the long-term objectives of HUPO are to map all these proteins, molecular isoforms including all the PTMs, cellular tissue, fluid and organ expression. So now you can see the complexity. Every single cell, tissue type, fluid, biofluid and organ has a different expression pattern in health, in disease, under stress, when you have eaten a heavy meal, etc., etc. So it already goes into a multitude mode. So we are going to get lots and lots of data. This is proteomic data, so we're going to get plenty of terabytes of data. So protein quantification, how much is there in biological samples? Can we actually find a change in the protein concentrations in the early stages of cancer in some distant organism? There is no need to actually do invasive tissue sample collection. All gene expression is done on the sample. So you have to actually dissect, go in, surgery or fine needle aspiration. You have to get the cells out. And in many times, if you take up the cells which are neighboring, you're not going to find evidence of cancer. Well, the cancer is proliferating merrily. So these are the problems that we currently face. Can we, through tissues and biofluids, find early changes? So that is our long-term goal. Of course, we can't do it all alone. I'm just voicing these goals so you will all get ideas and get to work. So to annotate all human proteins in a biological context, we need to understand their interaction networks. Proteins interact with proteins. They also interact with metabolites. They interact with DNA. They also interact with RNA. So they are very popular. And they are like party animals. They are always doing something or having coffee or something. So they are moving around really fast. So we need to understand them. But they could be prevented from leaving a cell. Some get transported across. The transporters are also proteins. So they play too many roles. Then we have comparisons of samples, normal and disease. This is being done. For those who know TCGA, the Cancer Genome Atlas, currently the Cancer Genome Atlas has come out with proteomics of the same samples for some cancers, not all, but it's starting. They are providing free proteomics data for benchmarking, for testing, for developing hypothesis. So you could look at that. At least 3 were there. We did work on ovarian cancer. So we are thinking of getting the proteomics data for the ovarian cancer. So integration of systems biology, that is thinking of things not in isolation but as bigger teams or systems. So genomics, clinical, phenotypes, etc. all integrated. This is our first step towards big data. There is no point in going out there and collecting all the data, because data collection is like stamp collection or building a library. So unless you have a targeted study that collects the data required for a disease and therefore a therapeutic approach, you do not continually get funds to collect data. Collecting data is also expensive. So please keep all this in mind when you write a grant. But if you need references, please use BD2K, because they are putting out lots of calls for this kind of work. And the rest of the world will be left behind if they don't hurry up. So the chromosome-centric human project actually takes the proteome component of each chromosome, and many world players have put their hands up to study them and characterize them. So all the chromosomes are divided. 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Different disease teams are studying the diseases, and the protein knowledge that is generated is being agglomerated into a knowledge base in Switzerland, into a mass spec repository, and into antibody. Antibody is a bit suspect because it is not clear whether the antibody is specific for that only one protein. How would you know if the antibody is specific for that one protein? So in the mouse, they actually do a knockout. They either use RNA interference or they knock out the gene and then see whether the antibody binds to something else. I think that will be tough to do in humans. So you can see the limitations already. Might have to do it on cell types. Okay. So Chromosome 7 was adopted by Australia and New Zealand. So we have my colleague coming over and saying, right, we have 5.3% of the human genome assigned to us. We need to do something real quick. Next week, can I have a paper? Okay, all right. So 2003, it was the first metacentric chromosome to be sequenced. It is very important biomedically. We are interested in it because it has T-cell receptor, homeobox, erythropoietin, cystic fibrosis, the first genetically solved disease, as well as other cancers. It has many of the molecules that are important for colorectal cancer, which is a big cancer in Australia. I think the barbecue is here to stay and we are running into problems. So, Scherer and Green suggested way back in 2003 that chromosome 7 is ideally suited to serve as a model for human genome studies. So we said, okay, let's go back and look at it. What is known, we looked at all this. And then we said, instead of the knowledge base, we will use these three data evidences. MS, structure, 3D structure of protein and antibody, to understand what is known and what is not known. What do we mean by not known? The human genome contains so many protein coding genes. All these genes, many of them were found by computer programs. On the other hand, we have biochemists and protein chemists isolating proteins and showing they are present as a protein, as a polypeptide chain. And that is the real evidence. So if you don't have that evidence, the rest of it is considered missing. So when we looked at the data for human proteins from NextProt, many of them do not have evidence. So we manually sorted to find those that are truly not there. We think they are there because they are in the genome, but we are not sure if they are ever processed into transcript and translated into protein. So we sorted everything, and then we found that only for chromosome 7 of the 946 proteins at that time, we had evidence for quite a few, but 19% are missing. So this is like going into Africa, right? Going into the depths, finding something new. So we thought, okay, good idea to do this. So we wanted to look at the proteins, so we did. We thought, if we are the pinnacle of evolution, surely this protein has been seen somewhere, right? And if it is really a protein that's seen in other organisms, there is a much better chance it's going to be seen in us. Okay, it's possible, although we eliminated all the proteins that makes vitamins in the metabolic pathways. That's besides the point. Those genes simply are non-functional or they're there. So we thought, let's look for homologs. We know the best tool to use is BLAST. So all we need is BLAST to identify putative homologs. But the problem is when you run BLAST, you get these big lists, unknown, putative. What do you do with that, right? So we're trying to look at that. So the challenge is to gather evidence from close homologs, assign functions, and look for prototypic peptides. These are single tryptic peptides that identify uniquely as a protein, so that we can look for the mass, maybe do SRM or something else at the mass spec level to look for them. Or even make the protein, look at the spectra, and then match other spectra in the other MS databases. So those are the ideas that we started with. So we looked for homologs. So all we get are a big list of uncharacterized proteins, unknown, putative, function unknown, maybe, etc., etc. Doesn't help. So we wanted to see how we can use informatics to cleverly get the knowledge, and that was our idea. So human beings evolved, and now they sit in front of computers. Okay? So this is what we want to do. So we took the road not taken. Everybody runs a BLAST, but we wanted to do something different with BLAST. We have already a lot of experience doing workflows, so I'm not going to do this. And we even used it in some of the genomes where I got my so-called Nature and Nature Genetics papers with collaborators, because these days you can't survive in academia without all this, it seems. So we've come to that. We did one of the first proteomics and transcriptomics combined studies as well in whole cell proteomics. So finally we decided, if we want to get high quality data, we must use non-human mammalian proteins which are reviewed and which have been experimentally validated. So then we know the matches to them have a very good chance of being found in human. Everybody said try primates, but there is nothing, no biochemical evidence for any primate sequence. There is very little data. We have a lot of data for mouse and a little less for rats, but not for any of the other species. I worked on the bovine genome, but it's pretty bad. We don't have much real concrete biochemically assigned proteins. So where do we go? So we chose this lot, and then we said if we can't find those, what we can't find we will pipe into the next lot, which is reviewed all the mammalian proteins. Look at all of them, whether they have evidence or not, doesn't matter. The third category is, did we come out with any brand new proteins? Are some of the proteins clearly unique to human? So that's what we wanted to check. And then finally look for 3D structure. Why? This will very quickly tell us what is the functional role of the protein. If a homolog is directly matched to a 3D structure, we can therefore assign the function via homology. Sequence homology is not as well conserved as structural homology, so we use that. So we did that, and we also did verification data sets so that we can actually check whether we're doing the right thing, we're doing the wrong thing. And then after all this, we did functional annotation by gene ontology, and this is the lovely cloud image that I found from the program last ago. So this helps us to understand whether this protein is going to be in a subcellular localization, in a cellular component, and what the biological process could be. And then we looked at pathways. So if we have a full pathway and something is missing, we know. If we know the pathway is functional, then that protein probably exists, has not been characterized. Remember when you do, and of course we found this pathway, so we were very happy. The student showed me how we are getting a hit to the caffeine pathway. Okay, we did functional characterization using InterProScan. All this is published, you can read about it. And when we found that pre-processing the data was very important, this is what we found in the human genome annotation, right? 3 repeats, 3 identical protein sequences. Why are there 3? Because you can have different genomic transcriptional start sites, but leading to the exact same protein product. Unfortunately for us, the protein doesn't tell us where it came from on the chromosome. So we had to merge the 3 entries. So that was done, different coding sequences. 5 proteins were from viral origin, viral insertion sequences. So obviously there's no point in trying to annotate it as a human sequence, so we removed those. So we ended up with 170. We ran it through a pipeline workflow. This was not a computational pipeline, this was a concept map in my head. So we did this systematically. Now we have actually built the pipeline which will just throw the data and get the results out, because we already figured out rationally how to do this. So we got the number of hits, removed these, dumped it in this data set, ran one more blast, then one more blast, then one more blast, and then through all the annotation pipeline. So this is the results. I think we can skip, you can read the paper. This is what I was telling you. When you look for matches, most of the matches are to mouse, and then to rat, and very few to primate. We don't actually benefit from having the primate genomes because there's very little known about the proteins. Functionally, there is very little overlap. All the methods seem to give independent functional characterization. Then we did triptych judges. This is the summary. We actually were able to annotate quite a few of the sequences with only 16 remaining unannotated. These could be pseudogenes, or they are proteins of unknown function because they don't match to anything. Or it could be the gene finding program made a mistake. We don't know. So currently these are in limbo. So it was published quite some time ago. We have done this whole thing for the entire human proteome that came out this year. We also used it for the truffle, the Perigord truffle. This is a generic pipeline. Actually, we grow Perigord truffle in New South Wales. It's a very big cash crop because it's worth $1,000 for 1 kilo. So, and we are out of phase with the rest of the world. When they have their summer, we have our winter. So when France runs out of Perigord, they import it from Australia. So we did the genome, and the exact same pipeline was used. Of course, the underlying databases had to be changed from human and mammalian to fungi. So we did that. Okay, so these are all systems that we made. We also worked on protein-protein interactions. This was what I was telling you. The UPAR, urokinase plasminogen receptor, is critical and overexpressed in breast, colorectal, lung, prostate, liver, pancreatic, ovarian, and breast cancer, brain cancer. Okay, it actually, this is the reason what it does. It binds to integrin alpha V beta 6. Beta 6 is a very strange subunit which is only expressed under cancer conditions, and that is under disease conditions, and it's epithelially restricted. So it has a lot going for it as a prime candidate for drug discovery. So there was this hypothesis that these two interact together. Do they interact? That was done through PLA, protein ligation assays, peptide ligation assays. Besides that, we also did a structural modeling to see what happened. Okay, lots of integrins, so we had to figure out what to do, and the proposal was that these two have strong alpha V beta 6 binding sites from overlapping peptide array measurements. Now in an overlapping peptide array, every peptide is small in solution. So what do you think its structure would be? It would be beautifully extended, very much like a peptide that is presented by MHC. Unfortunately, in a real folded situation, some of these may be false positives because they are not going to be accessible to another protein. So our job in building a 3D model was to eliminate the false positives and come up with actually something that matches the literature or their other study. If we had found matches here that were according to docking or our computational procedure, we would have looked really silly. Fortunately, we were lucky. Alpha V beta 6 is another complicated molecule. It is membrane bound, 2 different subunits. Structures of some of the integrins are known and structure of UPAR is known. So we built the model using a complicated strategy. 3 different structures, 4 different structures in fact were integrated for just the integrin. Built in the calcium binding sites, 6 new disulfide bonds, cytoplasmic and transmembrane domains, and the full structure was built for the first time, validated, and then checked for functionality with other known RGD binding domains for other integrins, and then we docked the UPAR complex using structural docking. This is a totally different thing that biologists don't normally do. Biochemists do, crystallographers do this. So you need to have a slightly different training to do this. It's not tough, but you can be trained, you can do it. So we actually put in the other known binding partners as well. Vitronectin is here. This is UPAR and this is integrin. And we actually eliminated one of those and showed that only the site on domain 3 is the high affinity site, and the site on domain 2 was actually a false positive. So that was a conclusion, because when UPAR binds, it can't actually use all the domains to contact the other protein. So some of these got eliminated. We have a very big study on biomarker discovery with cancer, which is like our big data study. It's not as big as NIH's, but definitely it has lots of data. And we integrated all this. We use protein gene expression data, protein interaction networks, Boolean logic, and then we integrated all the data. The logic was used to eliminate some of the data set. When you're trying to find a needle in a data set, that is the gene expression with 20,000 genes at least, you want to be sure that you can cut it down in some way to a manageable number, and that's what we did. So we did a systems approach, and we worked on ovarian cancer. I think many of you are already familiar with all this. It is called the hidden killer because it's very serious, and the problem is that only 40% of ovarian cancer patients actually survive after 5 years, but with early diagnosis, 80% could survive. It's very difficult to detect, and most people don't get detected till it's too late. So we took the TCGA public data with 237 high-grade serous ovarian cancers with different levels. We took level 3, which was interpreted data, and we randomly selected one of the batches. I don't know why we selected this. We selected one because already the data set is very large. Then at that time, this report came out when we were starting this work from TCGA, that they had found many of the known oncogenes. So we wanted to see if our study would bring out something new. So we took the gene expression data. Everybody uses standard deviation. We thought that's not such a good idea because what is standard deviation? We are looking at a bell curve, and this has nothing to do with the bell curve. We use fold change. Now fold change is done by, we used actually the rank product approach. The rank product is what you get when you run a Google search. It's exactly the algorithm behind Google. Ranking the pages. They use PageRank. We use rank product, which is another R program, statistical programming language. It has exactly the same implementation. Normally when you run a Google search, you actually find something, right, that you're interested in. Similarly, we hope to actually discriminate between two states, the disease and the non-disease states. So tumor versus normal, that's what we were. This is the mathematics behind it. You can look at the paper, it's all there, or you can look at it in Google, it's there too. At that time when we started, we only had 6 hallmarks of cancer. So we decided to look for 6 characteristics that will help us to collect a subset of the gene expression data that represent these hallmarks. So we selected tissue specificity, transcription factors, post-translational modifications, kinases, and secreted proteins. Because unless it's secreted, how can it be an oncogene really causing cancer? So we thought that would be a biomarker that we can actually find in tissues or fluids. Then lastly, we use the fact that hub proteins in a network are frequently very important. So if you knocked out a hub protein or its levels changed, you can actually disturb or perturb the system. So we used hub protein from the protein interactome from our previous studies into this, and then we use gene methylation, because gene methylation is one of the new indicators of epigenetic changes. So in cancer versus non-cancer associated genes. So we have all these 7 attributes representing our hallmarks of cancer. We integrated lots of data from protein-protein interaction. There's a whole list there. Then we integrated functional attributes for each of these other characteristics from here. And then finally, we used a combinatorial influence and Boolean logic to actually discriminate between all these things that we get. This is the overall methodology. From about 11,000 genes that were considered in the TCGA expression set, we identified 2,000 odd as actually significantly different between the tumor and the normal condition. And this suggested out of these, 1353 were upregulated, 800 odd were downregulated, and they were considered the significant list to work with. So when you do rank product study, we are only looking at this tail and eliminating the bulk of the junk. This is why many biomarkers were identified previously to be housekeeping genes. You can't really use a housekeeping gene as a causative gene for a disease. So this was one of the issues. So we are trying to discriminate between 2 conditions, and using that, we could actually figure out that only this small portion could be relevant under mathematical conditions. Then we used Boolean logic to come up with numbers that will discriminate between these. And finally, more choices were made, etc., etc. And then we came out with these lists of which ones actually pass the test for each of these characteristics. As you can see, methylation is both the same for differentially and non-differentially expressed. Similarly, secreted proteins, they don't seem to matter. The other conditions are really important. So we came up with a list of only 17 genes, 7 upregulated, 10 downregulated, and 48 non-differentially expressed genes in our final list to be studied for biomarker. And we did pathway analysis and validation using GEO, an independent data set. And this is what the results look like. These are our upregulated and these are our downregulated. Some of them are familiar to you because they're already known oncogenes or biomarkers, but some are actually different. Now, when we sent it to publication, the reviewer said, no, we want to see survival data. Okay, back again to the working board. The problem with TCGA was many of the patients had already died or never reported for the follow-up. So they did not have survival data for many of the patients. So they only had 7 normal and 38 cancer patients out of all the 239 in the data set. Still, we thought, let's do something. When we used the whole lot of our gene expression values for the up and down regulation, we are only looking at the final subsets. Okay, so the 38 that were normal and then the 17 that were differentially expressed. So we get this, which looked encouraging. So the green and the red, okay, heaved a sigh of relief. And they look like this when you calculate the means. So, okay, one step down. Then we looked at the differentially expressed where they actually come in a signaling network. And then we saw that some of them are actually present there. This one didn't help. This is a mess. But this centrality measure, 2 different centrality measures, actually showed that some of these genes that we identified were in the list. When we did the survival analysis, it didn't look so good initially because the p-values are not as low as they show in all these fantastic papers, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 5. No, it didn't look like that. It looked horrible. So then we said, okay, what do we do now? So we looked at high, low, regular, upregulation. Some of these in boxes, these 2 and this one, seemed reasonable, at least 1, 0. Okay, all right, we can do something with it. So we thought, let's look at these, they look good. And then we came up with something called co-analysis. Supposing we combinatorially use them mathematically, plus CHEK1 plus AR, androgen receptor minus link kinase. That actually was significant given the small size of the data set we had for the survival analysis. And at last we got the paper published. And funnily, I go for some other meeting somewhere else and somebody puts up a totally different talk on matrix metalloproteases. And then I see that some of these familiar players in our list are there, the 3 stars, 4 stars. They are all part of this DDR signaling network. So somewhere there is some analogy. And by the time, of course, we went through various revisions, Hanahan and Weinberg came out with more cancer biomarkers. And the reviewers, of course, say, how do your terms match to these? Okay, all right, we did one more thing, finally we got it published. So don't give up, okay? That's what I want to tell you. The data may be large, but only a small fraction of it makes real sense. And you have to be smart enough to find where to find it. That is going to be your key in the future. You can get bigger and bigger data sets, but much of the data will not be relevant to treating a disease or to finding an early biomarker for a disease or even any other condition. Okay, so remember, you need to sift the data till you find the few nuggets and then you are in business. Even then, you may run into reviewers. So remember that problem as well. Okay, so my acknowledgements today are to Academy of Science and MIMOS, who invited me to run this workshop, which is currently going on. We took French leave because one of our colleagues is holding the fort and doing R, biostatistics today. Tomorrow I will do the protein structure and modeling. Asif has already done his share, which was sequence analysis, databases, tools, etc. So I thank Asif for the kind invitation, all of you for being so patient and sitting quietly.